Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tech Summit. I'm really excited about our topic today. Not only is it very timely and popular with our members, it's also an area that I personally don't know a lot about. So I'm looking forward to learning today from our thought leader experts that we have joining us. And I'm going to open with just a few PowerPoint slides to set the stage and help everybody understand what we'll be talking about. And then the bulk of our time together will be just conversation, interview, discussion. Definitely we'll be keeping an eye on the questions. So as questions occur to you, go ahead and submit those and we'll try to work in as many as possible. And we definitely have lots of time reserved at the end for audience Q&A. So hopefully we'll get through as many as we possibly can. So about one of our events last year, I think it was Orlando, I hosted this session around partners, and TSIA launched a channel partner research practice several years ago. And you know, when TSIA says partner, they're usually referring to reseller partners. But it was interesting in that session, I had people showing up thinking that partners were their outsourcing partners, their service delivery partners, or their reseller partners. So I know that it's kind of a loaded term, and we are going to be talking about partners from a couple of perspectives today, and the first is the reseller partners. So I wanted to open, I'm sure you've all seen this data, but we recently completed an economic sentiment survey from our members, and kind of an interesting look at what people are expecting next year. You're all heads down and planning for 2023, but the majority of companies, 73%, do expect revenue growth next year. And, you know, that means professional services is definitely going to get a bigger number. But we also see a lot of rationalizing of resources going on. Nearly half of companies are expecting hiring freezes or even layoffs. And more than half, 57%, expect their budgets to be flat or reduced. So, you know, there's revenue growth means new business, new customers, new accounts to implement, but it also means you're going to have to be really smart about scaling if it's going to get trickier and more difficult to bring in additional resources. So we'll be touching quite a bit today on the role of technology and how it can really help professional services and definitely revenue generation grow. So there has historically been, with these reseller partners, a big focus on revenue and sales. And this survey shows that for a third of our members, a huge portion of their revenue is coming through these channel partners. I'm guessing those are primarily hardware companies, but maybe some software as well. But, you know, as we are looking for new revenue sources, there was a huge buzz at our recent Vegas event about how do we enable partners so we can continue to up the revenue that's coming through that channel. And we're also seeing a lot more focus on creative enablement of partners. And this was another survey we did a year ago that showed that companies are starting to extend even their customer success best practices to their reseller partners, providing them with success plans, some best practices around identifying expand selling opportunities, what are the typical adoption curves, and how do you help customers overcome adoption barriers. But I continue to see that the primary focus with these reseller partners is selling product, and there's not as much focus on services. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how are we enabling these reseller partners to better sell services. And you know, TSIA is largely focused on services areas. We've got a lot of data showing the percentage of total corporate revenue coming from services is significant, as much as a third of revenue for some enterprise companies. And yet, according to our professional services benchmark, only 39% of companies are evaluating the performance and quality of the services being delivered by these partners. So that's a bit alarming that you're turning over implementations to another group, but you're not really monitoring how well they're doing. And whether you sold the deal or one of your partners sold the deal, ultimately you need a successful implementation if they're going to have rapid time to value, high adoption, which is going to influence renewals and expand selling. 51% of companies are offering toolkits for these third parties to easily access your intellectual property, your methodologies, your defined project plans, and that's not enough. For half of companies, you're expecting your partners to just do it on their own. And another thing we're going to be spending time on today is professional services is spending an enormous amount of time creating these offers and these project plans and these fixed price repeatable offers. How can we better enable our subcontractors and third-party implementers to gain access to all of this content to help make them more successful? So the final data slide I wanted to share is currently 20% of total PS project hours are being delivered by partners or subcontractors. And I've got some data here on the margins for internally delivered projects versus some subcontractor projects. And, no surprise, the subcontractor margins tend to be a little bit lower. And I think that's one of the reasons that maybe companies haven't focused quite as much on building out that subcontractor network. But there are a number of industry forces that I think are going to force you to be more comfortable with this model. We've got some data, and I'll be sharing that a little bit later. Younger workers, particularly millennials and Gen Z, often prefer that contractor model. They like the gig economy. They like the flexibility it gives them. And we're also seeing that in recruiting, that maybe hiring is slowing, but most tech companies I know are still hiring consultants. Turnover is pretty high. If you're an experienced consultant, there's a lot of companies bidding for you. And, as you're finding that newer, younger employees maybe aren't looking for a long-term commitment to a company, I think we're all going to have to become much more comfortable with contractor resources. And we're going to be talking today about how we can enable them and help them be successful. So I'd like to now introduce our expert panelists of today, and I would like each of them to introduce themselves, give a little bit of background on your company and your role. And Stuart Harris, I'd like to start with you.
Thanks, John. Hello, everybody. Brief introduction for me would be I've got a bit of a hybrid background. I started my career as a CPA in professional services with Price Waterhouse. And I did 10 years in public accounting. I was an audit manager. And in that role, I spent my time managing staff, managing client budgets, managing the WIP, client expectations, billing, collections, resource management. And again, I did that for 10 years. I transitioned into the software and technology industry where I've had several roles in pre-sales and sales. I've worked for several companies. But most recently, prior to joining SAP, I was the managing principal of a startup cloud vendor here in Atlanta. And we had developed a application for insurance companies and financial institutions and some advisory firms to automate the management and compliance of their tax credit portfolios. Very, very niche solution. We ended up selling that company to a tax credit syndicator, and then I landed here at SAP, and I've been at SAP here for 3 years. And in this role, SAP goes to market by industry, and they like to hire folks who come from the industry to work with our clients and prospects, so we can bridge that, the technology to the industry and talk about solutions and value. And so that's how I work here at SAP. And John and team, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the panel today.
Well, thrilled to have you with us, Stuart. You and Craig have participated in webinars with us previously, and we're glad to have you back. Interesting on that topic of recruiting industry expertise. I just did a podcast interview yesterday for CMOs, and we were talking about the fact that if you're going to start focusing on delivering value and outcomes, that there is no one-size-fits-all consultant anymore, that you have got to be an expert on particular industries, the business challenges, the goals of those industries, or else it's really hard to be taken seriously if you're going in to help them redo their processes or figure out how to leverage technology to reach those outcomes. So it's great to hear that SAP is focused on that. So next up on our panel is Laura Lafferty. Laura, welcome to the Tech Summit.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you having me. Hello, everyone. Laura Lafferty with Kantata Advisory Services. Jumping off of that last commentary, I also came from within the industry. I had actually been a Kantata customer, working in professional services. Started my career in professional services, delivering implementations, some customer trainings, and then with the software vertical that I worked with. Through rapid growth, we established an operation location in North America, and so transitioned into leading the North American operations, as well as then eventually taking Australasia under my wing as well. So through that journey, obviously learned quite a lot about all the different aspects of delivering, especially software, and obviously came in touch with Kantata through that journey as we became a customer. And so in advisory services, we are actually a team made up of former professional services folks who we kind of straddle both the pre-sales and post-sales side. So our pre-sales team helps with our prospective customers in their evaluation process, really understanding their scope, what their needs are, kind of their current state, and making some recommendations with respect to implementation to get them to their desired future state. We do a bunch of consulting as well to really understand their processes. What are some best practice recommendations for process improvements? Where are they on a maturity spectrum? And then helping to transition them into implementation, where the other half of our team works with existing customers to make sure that they're continuing to grow and evolve and get value out of the Kantata platform.
When I first joined a Silicon Valley company back in '95, I had been a customer, and they recruited me to come in and run product management because they really needed somebody from the industry that had credibility with prospects. Do you find that you've got instant credibility with your customers when you say you started as a customer?
Yes, I think that there's kind of two sides of the credibility. One being, I was a former customer, so especially when we are discussing things like implementation plans, I've been through onboarding, but also having the professional services background as well. It's that sort of instant feeling of, you can speak our language, you know what we're going through.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Next up on our panel today is Lauren Leonard. Lauren, welcome to the Tech Summit.
Thank you so much, John. Really a pleasure to be here, as always. And I'm the other LL on the panel today. Laura's team and my team work very closely together. I lead the Global Solution Engineering Division at Kantata. So that means that my team are a group of product experts for our world-class PSA solutions. My personal background outside of software is also in the consulting space. I have a passion for the industry and kind of industry analysis and optimization, which has really been key and a big part of my role in the solution engineering function. I've held numerous roles in the industry, from pure play consulting to a member of a delivery team and leader of software implementation teams. And in my work with Kantata, I've worked with hundreds of customers in their PSA journey, always with the focus on adopting best practices to kind of glean the most value from the system in a scalable way.
So we're doing a webinar with Kantata coming up on December 6th, and our speaker is Uriah Hakala. So I'm guessing both of you probably know Uriah?
He is a dear friend and colleague. Yes, we do, and I will be eagerly in attendance on that session.
Yeah, that topic is 3 strategies for success for professional services next year, and we're going to be touching on some of these subcontractor issues. So if this is a topic you're interested in, go ahead and get registered for that. It's on December 6th. And last and certainly not least, we have Craig Quant. Craig, thanks for being here. I think you may be on mute, Craig.
You know, I did put it on mute, and because I'm that normal work from home, I'm literally herding cats here and trying to keep the dog from barking. So apologies for that misstep. Yeah, name Craig Quantz. I'm as it says, I'm a strategic industry advisor with SAP. I've been with SAP for about 7 years or so. My background is mostly professional services with a heavy technology bent, and then also some stints with software companies, actually leading their services organization. Had an opportunity to work and live in several parts of the globe, certainly North America, also South America, Asia, and Europe. And I've leveraged some of that experience to provide some consulting services to companies who are expanding internationally, who want to expand their channels, to international markets. And so kind of a little bit of a varied background, including I actually started with Accenture, and I worked with a good friend who went on to found Mavenly. Kantata, that's Ray Granger. So a little bit of connections here if you go back far enough. Anyway, pleasure to be here today and looking forward to the discussion.
Well,
that's
great
a fun
to have
tidbit,
you.
Craig.
Yeah. Well, Craig, it's great to have you back with us again. Before we started, just gave my cat a big snack, hoping he will shut up and be quiet for the next hour. So I understand. Okay, well, I'm going to start diving into some questions for all of you. And, as I've said, today we are talking about partnering for professional services delivery from a couple of perspectives. And the first is enabling reseller partners to access your service catalogs and repeatable offers. Professional services teams at hardware and software companies have worked very hard to define these service offers that both enable customer success, but also deliver profitable revenue. I'd like to start with Lauren. How often are you seeing tech companies extending their e-commerce and configure price quote or CPQ capabilities to reseller partners so they can leverage the same configurations, the same packages, the same offers, pricing, discounting as the OEM and not have to develop and maintain their own systems? Is that a common thing, Lauren?
Well, John, surprisingly, I don't see this often, and I think it's a big missed opportunity. I mean, what I do see is the idea of extending their service offering from more of like a documentation and best practices perspective, maybe even with a pricing guide. But what I don't see is the actual technology, or very infrequently, being extended. Again, a huge missed opportunity. I think the ideal model is when that OEM, as you said, extends not only their catalog of offerings, so including project templates, configurations, pricing, but their tooling as well. And as you point out, when they can extend that tooling, the new reseller partner can get onboarded faster, right? And in a controlled environment, and that promotes greater success of product sales. So a huge benefit there. And I guess I would also say CPQ tooling, and specifically service-centric CPQ tooling, I think is really just starting to pick up traction. So that's kind of a huge relief and departure from the massive spreadsheets that I've seen with so many customers over the years. But I think it's relatively new technology, or new from an adoption perspective still. And so, you know, you're not seeing service providers extend that software to their resellers in an optimal way like they could be.
Yeah,
That's my
unfortunately,
experience.
I talk to PS groups all the time that say, yeah, my company just launched e-commerce and a product CPQ engine, and we didn't even know about it. We weren't asked about it. We've got no service offers included. So, you know, it doesn't help with attach rates when services aren't even part of the picture.
Exactly. And I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of work to do from an adoption perspective with the services CPQ. And actually, you know, talking about packaging work more frequently, repeatable projects, I think that will make adoption easier of CPQ tools. I mean, certainly it will. I think a huge barrier to entry is all of the different kind of combinations and permutations. And so there's always like kind of a phase one approach to implementing the services CPQ. So the idea of extending the CPQ to partners and resellers is very much, you know, a stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. And in my personal experience, I don't see many customers get to that level. But I would be curious if others have any other experiences.
Yeah, Craig, I'd like to get input from you on this. Obviously, SAP is one of the industry leaders in e-commerce and CPQ. Could you talk about if you're seeing vendors extending those capabilities to resellers? And Johan in the audience is asking for a better definition of CPQ, so maybe you could address that as well.
Yeah, I'll try to. Maybe I'll take that last piece, that question on the CPQ, and obviously any of the other panelists, please jump in for a better description. But CPQ, configure, price, quote, is really it's really the capability to kind of start putting packages and bundling together. So in its simplest form, it's going to support a pricing and quoting of an individual product, and as Lauren mentioned, it's starting to get extended into services. But the C part of that is what gets it kind of complex, because that's when you start to say, I'm configuring maybe not even an individual product, but configuring packages or bundles of products and services together. And so there's a lot of complexity with that, not just on the front end of actually configuring it and supporting the price and quotation, but actually determining what those bundles should be and keeping that up to date. And so there's more to probably be said on that, and I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure that we'll get into that further as we have the discussion. In terms of what to see, there are so many models out there for an OEM or a technology vendor producer working with resellers. There's so many different models out there, but I think underlying what kind of Lauren said, you know, the key challenge is a lot of the data and information, just being able to share that between the OEM, the producer, and the reseller, and make that available to the market. So an ultimate situation is if you can actually share the tooling and do that. I don't see that very much. Obviously, what that kind of requires is kind of a one-to-one. So if you're a reseller and you represent just one or have a predominant practice with one vendor, then you can do that. You know, when I work with resellers that are coming from the distribution angle, they may represent tens or hundreds or frankly even thousands. I have one that has 12,000. They represent 12,000 vendors. You know, you can't do that, right? Because you could pick the one, but then you'd have the 11,000. You'd still have the data issue coming from the other 11,000 that you have. So the key that is just managing that data and that flow of information, and it's not simple, and a lot of times it's it's manual, and then most of the resellers have put in place some automation to get automated data feeds and to bring that together. And that information is obviously about the product, about the pricing, about promotional products, about promotions going on, rebates that are available, et cetera. But then there's also a configuration issue that happens at the resellers, because resellers who represent multiple vendors offer packages that go across vendors. So they don't get that configuration or the packaging information from a single vendor because, for instance, if you're a cybersecurity distributor, you're providing services that do that, you're probably going to put together a solution that encompasses maybe hardware from 2 or 3 different vendors and software from 5 or 10 different vendors to really provide that solution. And John, we've talked before about solution orders and billing and that. Yeah. That trend, and that's what's kind of happening on the front line. So as Lauren pointed out, it doesn't happen much. Would be really great if it could happen more in terms of sharing the technology and the underlying operating system or infrastructure between the vendors and the resellers. But you do have this complications of, one to many, basically.
Well, yeah, I asked that question assuming it was a smart thing to do. I think that there's got to be advantages of extending those technologies and capabilities to your reseller partners as far as giving you visibility into the pipeline, consistency of service delivery, et cetera. But Lauren, could you talk to, what are the advantages of doing that?
Well, yes, I think everything you just said. So first of all, there's an inherent, best practice that the OEM kind of creates, right? So as they're kind of packaging their services, right, they're defining what the best practices are. And as I said earlier, by extending their packaging, they can extend that best practice to the reseller. And then from a pricing perspective, I think there's some additional benefits, right? So being able to mind the margin, perhaps the OEM has a baseline for what the margin is going to be, and they could potentially track what those resellers or how they're performing against that baseline. That would allow, of course, the OEM to provide guidance to make sure that their resellers are successful and that partnership is really going to develop and flourish. I think that's one of the ways. And it's also, if you're going to extend that model, it's also a way to say, well, maybe that reseller has some best practices that we internally can adapt or could extend to our other partners and resellers. I think there's some additional benefits outside of just pricing when we think about just the way that we're structuring the project plan as well. When you think about resourcing, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In my experience, I've seen that partners often have a particular way of resourcing, right? And if we can kind of control or collaborate with them in terms of the timing of adding resources or the types of resources that they add, then we can optimize delivery there.
So I would think one of the barriers would be that the reseller wants to preserve their own branding, look and feel, in the technology. Stuart or Craig, could one of you speak to the ability to really white label these technologies so the partner could put their own, logos or colors or brands or whatever? Is that an easy thing to do?
Stuart, you want to go ahead and take that one?
Yeah, you can feel free to add, Craig, but yeah, we see that a lot where you are masking that. The resellers do have the ability to personalize and make it look like their own, intellectual capital, if you will, or presence. So we, in my experience, we highlight that, and in my software experience working for other vendors, being able to personalize solutions and through the network is definitely something that's done.
So we've got a couple of questions from Tom. who I'm guessing is struggling to get services a seat at the table for these CPQ projects. He says that unless the CPQ projects are specifically for services, they don't tend to happen, and some companies don't really seem interested in delivering products and services in the same bundle. You know, my reaction to that, Tom, is it's kind of a culture issue, that if the company has really moved to selling outcomes and value and not product, services becomes a very critical piece of the bundle, because if you're not selling value-added services to facilitate and streamline the time to get to the outcomes they're anticipating, you're never going to be successful. And I know that a lot of legacy companies are product companies. They're not outcome companies, and that's a very difficult transition for them to make. At a lot of startups that I talk to, you know, services is a core part of the value prop, and it's automatically something that's included in configurations. But, you know, any reactions from the panel on that? Do you often, you know, is services left out? Are they an afterthought? How do we get them a seat at the table?
Hey, John, this is Craig. Let me take a little shot at it. I think that this is one of the big challenges when you have the trend in the marketplace where people are looking to put together and offer solutions, and this is happening even more even at the reseller level, right? So all the resellers that may have worked in that are coming from the product perspective have had a business that's a relatively low margin. They're very aggressively expanding their services offerings, right? And that's going to be the frontline provider of solutions to their customers. But what has happened, and still is kind of, I would say, is the most common case, is there are two streams. There's the stream that is related to products, and that's hardware and software products. And so that's a stream, and it kind of works well, and there's some CPQ capabilities that are in place, and the quotations are instantaneous. You've got product catalogs, and maybe you've made that self-service through an e-commerce, and then it goes through into your product fulfillment channel, or, you know, operations. And then separately, there's a services piece where if you want to get services, that's a different avenue, where you then go through a quote process and determine the requirements and develop a proposal and develop a quote for that, which may take hours or days or even weeks. And then it goes through another operations process where you're actually executing against those services. And that's the way, that's kind of the state of the market today. But that's not where companies are going in terms of offering. They're offering these solutions. So what Tom brings up is that, you know, that when you get down to CPQ and the quotations and catalogs, et cetera, and the bundle definitions that are behind that, it works really well for products. But as I think Laura mentioned earlier, it's kind of just evolving for services. And so and that middle ground is what people try to do. What companies are trying to do more and more is productize services so that you come up with a fixed scope, fixed deliverables, fixed price. And that boundary used to be somewhere around $40,000, $50,000. After that, it got to be it became bespoke. You really couldn't do that. You couldn't fix everything. But we're working now with customers who are pushing it out 125, 150K, offerings that are fixed price, that they can productize, they can put a SKU on, they can stick it in a the CPQ, and get a quotation out, immediately, which is what customers who are used to buying products expect. But the technology to support true CPQ for services is, as was mentioned earlier, it's coming into its own now, but it's relatively new. And there's things like automated, generation of SOWs and all, and it's an evolving.
But it is tricky because services have people attached to them. So there's not an unlimited number of services, and you can't deliver a schedule or a time date at the time they make the purchase. So it's tricky. So I want to move forward, and again, I apologize if this is a stupid question, but it's something I don't know that much about. From an infrastructure perspective, we're seeing that it's easy to enable these technologies to your reseller partners. But could you shed some light on PS service delivery for resellers? How common is it that these resellers would adopt the offers that the OEMs have created to deliver with their own services team? Do you see the OEM's professional services team tasked with implementing deals from these resellers? So who's actually doing the implementation? Is the reseller own it? Does the vendor own it? Is there another party involved? Stuart, could I start with you? What is the most common model for who is implementing reseller deals?
From my perspective and experience, the most common model that I've seen is resellers using their own resources to implement and provide delivery. The vendors, the OEM or the vendors, they'll provide training and certifications and enablement and background support and expertise, but they're usually not the primary. The reason for that is when those resellers and partners deliver that successful project, it kind of sets the tone and foundation for that. You talked earlier about the expansion within the organization and the opportunity to provide additional products and services. So, controlling your own resource pool is a part of that. And then in terms of sharing service offers, I know from an SAP perspective and the partners that we work with that implement our professional service solutions, we will give them content and information, but in the marketplace, these partners are competing for work, and they'll take some of this information we provide and support, but they'll also want to, add a little bit of their own flavor to it to differentiate themselves and to show their individual value. And I mentioned earlier, this is driven by this whole trend in the industry of looking for outcomes. The clients now that they want to work simply, they want an outcome. And again, we've talked about this in previous sessions, but the whole everything as a service model is really the trend we're seeing right now.
So Lauren, could I ask for your thoughts on that? Do you see resellers always implementing their own deals, or do they work with the vendor or other third parties?
I'd probably echo everything Stuart said. I think the most standard model, right, is where the reseller has its own implementation team and supports the implementation themselves. Occasionally, you'll see a sub under that, and so the OEM may actually serve as a sub. Occasionally, you'll see other contractors that the reseller might work with. And I think also something Stu said about how there being an implicit competition amongst the resellers, I definitely see that. I think the OEM is really trying to control a certain amount of quality, right? So they want to make sure that there's a certain kind of baseline for delivery from a timeline perspective, from a pricing perspective, but also give the resellers the flexibility to add their special sauce. And then ideally that OEM would be able to kind of co-market and enable each reseller to its particular share of the market. So you see different resellers taking on a particular segment that they specialize in, or having a particular skill set that's really appropriate for a particular segment of the market.
So, there's a huge trend at the moment is monetizing customer success, and we've done a lot of webinars on this topic. And most of the offers that customer success is selling involve professional services, and it's usually value-added services, process modeling. I showed a slide earlier that we're extending more of customer success practices that a vendor develops to their reseller partners to help them be successful. Anybody on the panel, do you think this is an opportunity as they're defining these process, value-added services, offers specifically designed to speed time to value. Is there an opportunity to share all of those as well to the reseller partners?
This is Craig. No, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
I think we're just starting to see that, and as those offers take shape and can build on and extend platforms and certainly help with the kind of that attachment to the product and watching it grow. There's a lot of advantages to that, and when you think about, especially where maybe the reseller partner actually did the implementation themselves, that relationship has been formed with the client. They're very comfortable with them, and so that's where I see often the client will return to the reseller because they know them. They had that time together. They developed that trust. So having those available for the reseller to also take advantage of, and furthering that relationship, building on what's already been established, it just sort of tightens that circle a lot more.
So we've been talking mainly about e-commerce, CPQ capabilities, but I want to bring professional services automation into this as well. I'm guessing you're not seeing a lot of vendors extending their PSA capabilities to reseller partners, but I'm wondering, in light of the shift that we are seeing away from these custom pay-as-you-go travel and expense projects to now more than half of the projects being delivered are fixed-priced, repeatable. These have very prescriptive project plans, really setting people up for success. We're capturing what works and doesn't work every time we deliver it, so that project plan gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It seems that this should also be extended to the resellers so that they've got access to these amazing project plans that's guaranteeing consistency and quality. Is that happening today? Do you see a lot of potential for this? Any reaction from the panel?
I'd say I see this actually more frequently. So I think you're referring to the actual project plan itself, right? Not just the pricing aspect of it. And I guess I've been kind of extending the conversation to include the project plan when I've been talking about services CPQ. I actually see that more frequently because there's various mechanisms, including just inviting your resource pool, your extended resource pool, whether they're resellers or contractors, into your environment. So yes, and again, I think it goes back to wanting to ensure that there's some quality control and consistency. So sharing your project plans and your blueprints with your resellers, but also giving them the space to add their proprietary secret sauce.
Anyone else? Is that a model that you're seeing? Is that something we should be encouraging vendors to do as they develop more of these, strong project plans?
This is Craig. I'd just say I think there are obviously advantages in the more of the collaboration that can be done in even all the way back as was mentioned of the project plan, et cetera. In terms of making that happen, I think the most common piece is where all of the constituencies are invited to into an environment to collaborate on the planning and actually execution of the project. So I think, that's the kind of the desired state. And again, it just depends on the organizations, the relationships, and, how adaptive people are into working into different environments. The more gig workers are more adept, frankly, at working in a variety of environments than we saw. When it's a full-time employee, this is our system, this is the way it works. If I have to do something else, it's very, very difficult, are much more adept because they have to do that, right? They get assigned to a project and, we used X for project management. So adapt because you're part of that team now and make it work. Yeah.
So I'd like to shift now to the second angle on partners we're discussing today, and that's when the technology vendor closes the deal themselves, but they have to rely on third-party consultants, either individuals or a pure services delivery partner for the implementation. I shared some benchmark data earlier showing that on average 20% of total PS project hours are delivered by subcontractors. The higher end is 27 to 30%, not saying much beyond that. Let's talk first about separate services firms that a vendor would give projects to when they just don't have the capacity within their own PS team. As I was asking previously with resellers, do you see third-party services teams using the vendor's PSA technology, or do they have their own internal resource project management platform and they're using, only their own system? Laura, could I start with you on that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's something that we're starting to see more of happen. I think it's still fairly uncommon, especially if we're looking at situations where the entire implementation or entire project team is with that third party. They tend to want to use their own tool. It could be that they might be serving multiple OEMs, so they need to be able to see that kind of aggregate view of what's going on. There are times though, when it it is the case where maybe they're exclusively contracted. So if you have a partner reseller who is wholly dedicated to a certain product or a certain practice, then that tends to be sort of aware where people are doing that. And that tends to be the case where I see that. Or if there's, they essentially are on as almost like full-time employees. They're contracted, to provide quite a bit of work. So, they are essentially almost like, a version of their staff. But, I think the biggest gains where I see this happening, and this is kind of where I think it sort of starts, is in the resourcing element. So while the OEM may not give partners access to the entire system for the purpose of delivering the services, I am starting to hear more and more people wanting to or expressing interest in having them at least in there from a resource perspective. So having their reseller partners on the resource list, even giving them access to be able to update their availability, so that they have the OEM has a good view of even when partners are reaching some capacity and who might be available, so who to look for. So that's kind of where I have seen people kind of dipping their toe in the water, if you will, giving some access, so that they get the full resource picture.
Stuart, could I ask for your comments on this? When you started your life at a pure services firm, do they only use their own professional services automation, or are they willing to use, vendors' PSA systems for their projects?
Well, my experience is kind of dated when I was in the industry, but I've
PSA might not have existed back then.
Yeah, I'll date myself here for the audience. When I started at Price Waterhouse, your place in the firm was determined by the size of your calculator, your 10 key that we carried. If you had a big 10 key, then you were new, and then as you got promoted, you got a smaller one. But I have worked for PSA vendors, and when I got into the software industry, I worked for a firm called Novient, and that was the vision, was to be able to give firms the ability to, when they sell work, to be able to say, here's my pipeline of work that we could potentially sell, but I've got to be able to deliver, and I've got to be able to set expectations with the client. And so having a mechanism to look at your own resource bench, but also extend it to your, it could be individual subcontractors and people that you've worked with, or it could be firms. But having that network and visibility was definitely a thought, and this is 1995, 1990, 2000, the vision was there, and I think over time we've gotten closer to delivering that. The vendors are getting better at that collaborative environment. And we have a client we worked with here at SAP. Their whole business model is on the gig economy and the gig worker. They see it as the future, and they're developing applications to support not only the millennial young worker, but the person who's maybe experienced, retired, wants to work certain types of engagements in certain locations at certain times of the year, and being able to capture those preferences from these contractors and be able to staff firms to leverage that data and staff projects is out there.
So it seems that there are definitely advantages for subcontractors to use the PSA system from the vendor. It's ensuring consistency and quality of the service delivered, giving the client the same experience regardless of who's delivering the service. Also, it's giving the vendor more visibility into the projects and easily collaborate if the third party's running into issues. So why do subcontractors cling to their proprietary PS platforms? Do they just not want to have to juggle multiple platforms? And what can we do to encourage them, build that business case for them to adopt multiple PSAs and use the PSA from the vendor?
This is Stuart. So, why do they cling to their current systems? From my experience, they work, right? It's meeting their needs. It's not broke. They don't see it being broken, so they don't need to fix it. And what usually drives that, what's the compelling reason why people start looking at these automated systems is because, their client satisfaction is starting to dip. And they're missing deadlines. Their margins aren't what they're supposed to be. They can't staff projects. There's delays. The growth. Many of the conversations that I have with potential clients it's all around their growth plans, their diversification into new lines of work. These systems don't support it, and we've talked earlier too around being solution-based organizations, having your billing, your resource management, your quote all connected to have that seamless experience. If they're working in a disconnected environment now, and it's working for them, that's where our salespeople have a hard time convincing these prospects that there's value. And to the earlier question, a model that I see a lot, and I see it here with our partners and the partners I work with, it's not so much that the vendors are given access to a PSA system, but if you've got a vendor who's a SAP partner on our side, many times they will become a client and they will leverage our solutions to have that experience, develop their own resources, and be able to demonstrate in the marketplace that that they're an expert in the technology because they use it themselves. They drink their own champagne, if you will. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to convince people sometimes when they don't appear, they don't think their system's broken because, they're not having the issues.
Laura or Lauren, is this a great upsell opportunity? Because, you've got an opportunity to sell additional licenses of PSA to the vendors if they can extend it out. Is that something, you guys are focusing on?
Yes, we have a number of our partners, that are, well, I think most of our partners are customers. So there is certainly, and it's interesting that it kind of ties to one of the thoughts I had, where sometimes it's less about the subcontractor being reluctant to be on the platform, and it's more about the OEM being comfortable letting the reseller partner in. Because I hear both sides of it, and so the reseller, is especially if it's an individual, typically as has been mentioned, are willing and happy to use the OEM's tool, but sometimes it's actually the OEM who might be a bit hesitant for a variety of reasons to let folks in. But I think certainly for the organizations where you can bring them in, it is a great opportunity as well for, as an upsell to have those vendor licenses.
Mm-hmm. So I shared some data earlier that subcontractor margins are typically lower than projects delivered by your own PS team. I think some of that's obvious. You're paying additional fees to these third parties, which eats a bit into the margin. But I would think that if they were using the same PSA system and you were getting more visibility into expense tracking and utilization rate and all of that data around margins, you ultimately could help improve those subcontractor margins, so it does seem more viable to send more business that way. Could I get a reaction from anyone on the panel? Don't you think if everybody was using the same PSA, you could focus on lowering or improving those subcontractor margins?
John, this is Craig. The margins that are mentioned, is that the project level margin, or is that the?
It was the project level.
Okay, yeah, and obviously then I would expect that, because with subcontractors, you're capturing all of the cost into it, whereas with your own people, you're only capturing the direct portion of the cost, right? When people are looking at, what do I do it with my own team? Do I subcontract, whether that be to an organization as a subcontract or individual use of gig workers? There's this whole balance, right? Because your employees, you actually still have to pay them, right? You have to pay them even when they're not working on a project. It's the utilization. So there's a lot of, frankly, there's a lot of analytics that go on with a service as an organization to determine, in individual areas of expertise, where does it make sense for me to have a full-time employee versus subcontract that out, whether that to a reseller, to a third party, or even use gig workers, to supplement my staff, because I can let them go. So I think there's a lot that goes on. Now, the more that you're able to have all of the resources, working from the same data set, the more insight you have. Yeah, and then you extend that and say, okay, do I get that? Do I data set because everybody's using, say, the same PSA and it's all there, or are other things driving where I'm just not going to be able to do that, but because individual subcontractors are going to use maybe their own system? Then you come to the thing, okay, what data do I need to share to properly analyze, the results of the project, mm-hmm. the performance of the project, and as you said, potentially improve it over time. So everybody uses the same platform, then it's all using the same. If they're not, because, I have to use my own system, or subcontractor has to use their own system, then you get into the challenge that we usually say, okay, what data elements do you need to share to get a good view and to make sure that ultimately that the client's needs are being met.
So we've been talking about using a third-party services firm to own and deliver the implementation, but due to lack of resources, sometimes you've got individual subcontractors on a project team with your internal consultants. I'm assuming in this case, the subcontractors would automatically be given access to the PSA system since the project is managed there. Is that the case, Laura? Is that the common model? Subcontractors always get logins to the PSA system?
Yeah, I'd say it's becoming even more common. I think there are still organizations out there who, again, for one reason or another, are not providing that kind of access to their partners. And in those cases, it's related back to what was being said earlier around there's certain pieces of information, right? So there's time tracking. It's the completion of tasks, and what are the kind of the key pieces that would be updated perhaps by the project manager. within the tool, but certainly where there is a person here or a couple of people there, it is becoming much more common. You want that visibility. You want those 1, 2, 3 people who are making up the overall project team, at this point wholly owned by the OEM. You need that information. You want to see what they're doing. You want to see, what work is being completed, so that you're getting obviously the whole view of the project and how it's performing, and what the health of it is, and even start to be able to use that information, from that analytics lens as well. So, where you might have partners, subbing out certain roles, and then kind of looking at those projects, how they performed against perhaps ones that were wholly internal, and see what those comparisons might be. Were there elements of those projects that were moving quicker or slower or that sort of things, to go back to that idea of what can we learn from each other about how we're doing what we're doing. There also, as I mentioned, there's a lot more people who are starting to kind of treat these situations and the contractors they work with, the partners they work with, as FTEs. They'll provide them with a user license. They're visible in the resourcing process, and invited in to work on projects as the need arises.
So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience around gig workers, which we've mentioned a few times today, and I want to drill into that a bit. In a recent webinar, Kantata and I did, let's see, I've got a data slide here. They did some joint research with Atomic Research, and they found that half of Gen Z and millennial workers have considered becoming a freelancer or contractor. If younger workers are enamored with this gig model, it seems that professional services teams need to really embrace using subcontractors more often, especially as recruiting and retaining younger consultants becomes a challenge. What can companies do to better enable these individual gig workers to be more successful as consultants? Our benchmark data says it's taking an average of 48 business days for a newly hired delivery consultant to become billable. Obviously, you can't put a consultant through that amount of training. Craig, could you talk about some of the best practices of making gig workers successful?
Yeah, sure. And just for a clarification, I think in the data that you're sharing and along the line is really about gig workers. And this goes back to that previous question of what are you subcontracting? Subcontracting, there's a method of subcontracting where you take a work packages and subcontract it out to somebody else to be done. And that's pure subcontracting. But I think the gist of what we're talking about here is really the use of gig workers, the individual workers resourced into a project to provide things. And I'll tell you what, I know you had shared the data here before. The data may look high, but from our own personal experiences, Stuart's and mine, the data is probably even low. I mean, even very large organizations are using percentages higher, north of 30% of their staffing is done by gig workers, et cetera. So yeah, okay. Very, very prevalent. What I think what happens here is that while we had some examples and we talked about in companies, for instance, an OEM, a company developing their own and managing their own pool of subcontractors, of freelancers, of contractors, and that does happen. And there are some firms that's their whole business, RPG, Crosslake, that's what they do. They just perform projects directly with gig workers. They have no full-time employees. But the most common method for gig workers to work is through staffing agencies. That's why staffing agencies up, right? And what happens there is the staffing agencies build practices. So they actually build practices. So if you're going to go be called to work on a Salesforce implementation project, you are certified. You put that request into the staffing agency, they will find individuals who are certified to work on Salesforce implementation projects because they've gone through the training. Either they've gone through specific vendor training. Most of the technology companies have certification programs now for consultants who are going to use that. They use it for their own, but they also usually require it for freelancers, and then obviously supplemented by experience, et cetera. So the best practices in here are that it's not just a kind of a free for all. There's actually many of the technology companies, maybe going back to yours, maybe it's half, I think that's the data you shared, have some kind of a program in place where they're able to, provide education and certify individuals to be able to work on projects. The staffing agencies are picking that up now because then they'll be the go-to place if you're doing, again, a Salesforce implementation project. Then you should go to staffing agency X because they have a practice built around that. They have a pool of resources. Mm-hmm. And those resources, they apply to and work for those staffing agencies. Then they get their mobile app. And when there's something that comes up, they get notified and they look at it. And if they want, they swipe and they say, I'm in. That's the kind of state of the market now.
Lauren, do you have any thoughts on how to better enable gig workers?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Aside from, fostering the enablement packages and everything like that, from a pure technology perspective, I think Laura said it best, which is that we see contractors being treated like FTEs, included in project plans like FTEs. And in an ideal world, your PSA really fosters enablement and success for all your employees. So features, right, that you can look for are things like raise your hand so that resources can identify the types of projects they want to work on, or maybe they can even put in a request to the PSA, like these are, ideal project types for me. Also being able to include contractors as candidates. So sometimes you'll see this notion of recruitment candidates, and you can plan for when you think you're going to hire this employee at a particular time. Then there's going to be a period of onboarding, right, before they can be live and billable. So if you can extend that functionality to new contractors who are just starting to onboard with you and deliver your services, that not only sets them up for success, but you don't experience delays, right, in getting your project staffed.
Yeah, absolutely. So one final question, and then we'll go to Q&A. When the pandemic hit and everybody started working remotely, we saw a huge push from professional services automation vendors to incorporate more collaboration capabilities into the system because the implementation team wasn't sitting all together in a customer's office figuring this out. They were working, from who knows where, all over the globe. So these collaboration capabilities, it seems that is a critical part of making sure that these gig workers are being included in the team, that they're easily able to ask questions and get answers. Do you see that internal PS teams are really open to collaborating with these third parties that are on the project team, or do you see them kind of pulling rank and not always, helping them? I think it's kind of a knowledge sharing culture issue as well. Lauren, any thoughts on that?
Well, I kind of laughed when you said pulling rank. I mean, yeah, there probably is kind of almost a competitive component there. But I think another concern that I don't think we've addressed enough yet, which is just about visibility. What do we need to hold as kind of our internal information, even though we might be bound by, some contractual NDA or whatnot. So I think, yes, there's a desire and certainly a need for collaboration. The thing that can hold, vendors back from giving full visibility and access to their contractors or their resellers is that need to kind of put up guardrails. So you want your PSA solution to have some strict kind of field level security access, being able to define how you collaborate and what visibility there is. But definitely for the success of the project, you want your contractors to be able to, again, be treated like the team, collaborate with one another, use some sort of system of chat, be able to have full visibility into notes and documentation. And since we started the conversation talking about resellers, you want that same thing for your resellers, right? Because you want the success of their business. And then the last thing that I was just thinking about our own business, something that we worry about a lot, we're insistent that our partners are successful, because not only is that going to promote customer stickiness, right? But oftentimes it's our business that supports the ongoing customer, right? So if a partner gets them live and up and running and contractors contribute to that, great, but then they come back to us for support. So obviously it's in our best interest that we, have collaboration and can help them out in their journey.
Well, I would like to thank our 4 panelists for providing all of the great information today. I certainly have learned a lot about this topic, so I feel like it was a master class on not only how to better work with third parties, but also the role of technology in enabling them to be successful. We had a huge audience. We've got a lot of questions in queue. So Vanessa, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through some of the audience questions.
Perfect. Okay, so just as a reminder, because we do have about 15 minutes left, if you have a question for any of our panelists, please submit it through the Ask a Question box on the top left corner of your screen, and we'll get through as many questions as time allows. I'm going to start with this first question from Elaine, and they ask, do you see any trends or industry common challenges or solutions to managing the contractors for PS businesses? For example, contracting with them, streamlining purchase orders, reconciling AP invoices with hours worked, etc.
I'll take that to start. Just because I heard talking about streamlining purchase orders and reconciling with AP invoices. So this is something that I'm working with a current customer on. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a challenge. And again, something that can be solved or mitigated with a PSA, right? So rather than having contractors, log their time and send it to you manually in a spreadsheet, and then, looking at the original purchase order, et cetera, actually allowing your contractors to just log their time directly in your PSA tool, and then having some automation around matching that, something of a 3-point match to your procurement process. I'll leave it at that, because there might be others who want to react to common challenges.
Yeah, I think what Lauren was saying is so true. That the thing that we find as far as the greatest challenges is just that separation of all of that information. That you might have it fully contained in your PSA for your internal team, but for those contractors, it's having to track them down, and even with reconciliation down to what's being billed versus what's actually been logged, and having to reconcile through those differences. So the challenge we see with most customers is really how do they pull all of that information together, and make sense of it, but also make sense of it in a timely way, so that you're not delaying your your period close at the end of each month while you're sort of sifting through those various things. So that's where really that access to the PSA can make a big difference, because then it's all being tracked and you're also seeing it in real time. So when you're kind of gathering it, in some cases in a piecemeal basis, then it might be a bit too late to do something about any sort of discrepancy that you see. Whereas if they're kind of following the same best practice of updating information as they go, then you're getting visibility into that sooner, so that you can either divert some potential issues or at least flag things that you might see. So the more you can get everyone working out of the same playbook is just going to help on both the short-term level, but also long-term.
Okay. Our next question that I'm going to pose to the panel comes from Christina. And they ask, do you see different approaches with smaller private orgs versus larger public ones?
Yeah, Christina, I think in terms of the public-private, I'd say when it comes to kind of access hesitation, I hear that a lot more from public entities, or can be private organizations who work with public entities. So if there's government contracts, and even if there's data privacy restrictions, so if GDPR comes into play, so anyone who is trying to navigate around sort of data privacy or kind of access to data, do tend to be less willing or to take that step just because of the uncertainty, or it could be that the interest is there, but their PSA has limitations in terms of how the different data can be segmented and shielded from those contractors. So from a public-private perspective, definitely see the private side kind of moving a little more quickly in that direction.
Okay. Our next question here comes from Ken, and specifically he said this would be addressed for the SAP team or is directed to the SAP team. And they say, what are some of the other key issues resellers face in representing multiple OEMs?
Stuart, you want to take that, or you want me to?
Sure. I mean, my first thought is, recently we were engaged with a BPO, and they are offering these outsourced services that can include hardware, software services. They've got we talked about the CPQ process with them. There's so many catalogs, there's so many pricing scenarios, there's discounts, there's rebates, there's so much information that's being managed that one of their challenges is being able to look at actual end profitability. How are they performing on these quotes? You've got your budget or your quote or your expected margins, and there's so much data that's disconnected that it's really hard for them to have that visibility. And we see that. I've seen that quite a bit. I don't know if you have anything others to add, Craig.
No, I think the two big ones we talked. It's really that was the data. It's the data issue that you have so many different data sources, and it's very dynamic, right? In terms of the products, the pricing, promotions, et cetera. And then the other is what you talked about is struggling with the profitability, particularly, not of an individual product line, but when you start bundling things together, when you start putting hardware and software and services together, and how you bundle those and how you price those across OEMs. So an individual OEM can only help you so much, right, with it. The resellers struggle with, what are our profitable lines? And that just comes down to having the granularity of data and the attached to the individual customers and the scenarios and being able to analyze it properly. And so, but it is a big issue for those resellers, et cetera. And I think where it was mentioned a little earlier, that I think there's more of and this probably will happen even more in 2023 for the reasons that you stated earlier, John. The relationships between the OEMs and their resellers are getting tighter. They're getting closer. They're sharing more information. They're doing more planning, et cetera. And I think that is going to, that helps that situation where not just from the reseller standpoint, but the OEMs see what's happening out in the real world when it's not just a singular channel of their products out to the market, but where their products are actually being combined with other vendors' products or other OEMs' products to create solutions. So it's evolving, and it's really just it's information sharing and data sharing that's the challenge.
Okay, our next question is from Michelle, and they say, I am currently creating a partner certification. what are some ways or tactics for enabling and training partners to successfully deliver services?
Yeah, Michelle, I think that's great. Having a partner certification program is a really good step to, showing your customers that, there've been some rigor to who your partners are and what they're doing. I think there's, a few things that I've seen and even things that we do. There's a few different prongs to that. First being the product, right? So if they are implementing, then, if they are not currently familiar with the product or, extensively using the product, making sure they have some product training. So however you deliver your product training. The other piece of it is then the delivery. So what's your methodology? What are the ways that your team delivers? Do you want them to model that? I would assume you do. So having them walk through some methodology training, and then kind of coupled with that is then even having them shadow an implementation. So someone who's about to go through certification, having them kind of take a back seat in an ongoing or a new implementation where they can see the whole process unfold from end to end, so that they've had that experience. You can give them some responsibilities throughout that shadowing as well, so they're not completely an observer. But if I'm then running them through that end-to-end process, giving them that kind of first go round of here's how it all unfolds, seeing how your team actually does it, hearing the questions that clients are going to ask, because that's going to be very important as well to that credibility. Can they answer the questions that the folks are asking? And then the other piece to that is making sure they know who the right contacts are in the organization for any assistance, so that if they run into any issue or anything that they can't answer, do they know who the right person is to go to for that support, and making sure that they have those introductions to those folks who can support them in their efforts.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question here, and it's actually from Stephen, and they say, if different systems are used, how is data shared and managed?
Craig, you want to take that one?
Craig, you're on mute if you're speaking. Oh, maybe.
No, it took me a while to get to the mute button. Now, the comment that I wanted to make is just the sharing of data is always, it's really a factor of how well the data is managed at an individual organization. So if you are if you're a reseller and you are receiving information from multiple OEMs, and it could go the other way as well, right? The OEM receiving from the partner, from the resellers. You really need a strong data structure, data model. You need master data management, frankly, within the organization, so that as you receive data from the various sources, you're able to map it into your data structure and then make sense of it. And from there, you can actually, maintain product catalogs. You can go through that pricing analysis. You can do all those things that we talked about that are challenges. And they're challenges today for many of the organizations because certainly there's a lot of manual procedures in taking data from various sources and making sense of that. But if there's not an underlying master data structure, that challenge is amplified. So we end up working with a lot of our customers on master data management and having good data structure analysis to support that mapping, which then supports the automation, which then supports all of the the analysis that can be done. So, I don't know, others probably have other comments on that.
I think you covered it, Craig. So with that being said, John, why don't I toss it back to you for any closing remarks before we sign off for today?
Well, I think that we have seen that with forces in the economy and generational changes that we're going to have to find new approaches to better work with third parties. And I think with the big push on value realization, that we're also going to have to become more comfortable in sharing project plans and service catalogs with reseller partners as well as subcontractors. So hopefully this has been useful to the audience, maybe give some ideas for your planning in 2023. And we are going to be sending a recording out, and you can download the slides. That'll go out very shortly. So I would encourage you to share this recording with some of your teammates. So thanks again to our panel. Thanks all of you for joining. I know it was a big time commitment, but I had a lot of fun and learned a lot, and hope you did too.